Let's start with one of the major events of the week, and that was President Xi and President Biden actually meeting around the APEC meetings out there in San Francisco. It's hard to know where this will go, but so far so good. They seem to be trying to really pull themselves back from the precipice.
Look, it's important to have meetings like this. Churchill famously said, much better jaw-jaw than bang-bang. On the other hand, I think we need to remember that there are very difficult fundamentals here. Very different systems, very different views of the world, profound competition in the technological arena, concerns on the American side about China's subversion of our vision of the international system, concerns on the Chinese side that the United States is trying to hold them down. So there are very profound geopolitical forces at play, and this struggle is going to be with us for a very long time. So I'm glad to see the meeting, but I'm concerned, and I'm particularly concerned in light of the gravity of the economic challenges that China is facing. And my concern is that, as with the Soviet Union in the 1960s, a sense of very serious economic challenges is going to drive a felt need for increasing assertiveness in the international arena, as we saw with Khrushchev's moves on Berlin, as we saw with the placement of missiles in Cuba. And while I don't see anything concrete like that that's happening right now, I think the economic distress and the link to nationalism, given some of the very strong positions that Xi has taken, is something that is going to require the United States and the West to be on their guard going forward.
Global Wall Street's paid a lot of attention this week to those CPI numbers that came out for the United States. Some people are, if not declaring victory, close to declaring victory over inflation. Are they premature?
Look, those were good numbers. Those were better numbers than I would have expected, better numbers than I think most people would have expected. And I think inflation performance has been more favorable, certainly than I have expected over the last year. And I've thought a lot about that, David, and I think there are two or three factors to emphasize. The first is that policy has been much tighter than was anticipated. In July of 2022, markets were assigning a probability of under 10% to the level of tightness in policy that we have seen so far. So more tight policy has led to better outcomes on inflation. That doesn't mean inflation fears were unwarranted. It means that people took the fears seriously, which was good. I think that's one important aspect. I do think that given how strong the economy has been, there's still a surprise in what's happened to inflation. And that, I think, has to do in part with transitory factors that were pushing inflation up from bottlenecks that are now mean reverting and are pushing inflation down. So I think there's been a little bit of prematurity in some of the declarations of victory. And I'm not sure the inflation figures over the next 2 years are going to be quite as favorable as the market is expecting, especially in light of the geopolitical risks around oil and some other commodities. So we'll have to see whether we're really able to get down to 2% quite as easily as many people imagine. And
what is the risk right now of a recession in the first half of next year?
It's certainly under 50-50, David. I think it's probably on the order of 25% that ultimately something will happen which will cause the NBER to date a recession as having begun in the first half of the year. In general, when recessions come, we don't even know that we're in them till they've been underway for several months. So I think you got to recognize that as a real risk. On the other hand, with what we've been seeing in the employment reports, incomes are continuing to grow. So I don't think that is the preponderant scenario.
One thing that may be adverse in store is actually the size of the federal deficit. A lot of talk about that this week. It appears we've avoided actually shutting down the government. People came to their senses, but it's only up to next January before they come to it again. And the main issue is not even what they did this week, but the larger issue about the weight that this may impose on the U.S. economy.
If somebody's got a basic problem of being overweight, it's good if they skip dessert. It's good if they check into a spa for a weekend. But what really matters is whether they change their habits and they change their lifestyle. And nothing in this agreement or anything in the discussions currently underway is about changing the American habit or lifestyle with respect to spending and taxes. I look at the world right now, and it is the most ominous world geopolitically that I have seen, certainly since the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. I look at projections for the federal budget that call for defense spending as a share of GDP to fall substantially. I don't think that should happen, and I don't think that will happen, almost regardless of how domestic politics play out. And so I think as I look at the budget picture, we got to recognize that we've got a big national defense liability ahead of us that we're not really budgeting for in the current projections. And much more generally, David, is a very profound question of how long the world's greatest debtor will remain the world's greatest and most secure power. And so I think that everybody talks about our resilience as a country. Well, part of resilience for a company, part of resilience for a household is containing your leverage and containing your borrowing. And I think that's something we need to think about as a nation.
Larry, just give us a little wisdom from the 1990s. You served in the Clinton administration back then when they got their arms around the budget. And my recollection, to continue your analogy to dieting, if you're going to lose weight, you can't just exercise, you can't just cut back on what you eat, you got to do both. And right now, one might think we have one party who doesn't want to increase taxes and increase revenues, the other doesn't want to cut spending. How did you manage in the 1990s to get over that hump?
Well, I'm happy to try to answer the question how Bill Clinton managed. I don't want to be the one taking credit for the 1993 budget deal. Look, I think he laid out the case. He brought people together. He was willing to do things that were painful for the people who were his friends. He was able to explain the case to the American people, and that's the kind of leadership we're going to need. And he reaped a benefit that I think people need to recognize and that maybe hasn't come into focus quite yet.